The last step in cellular respiration, called the electron transport chain, takes place in mitochondria. This step is essential for producing enough ATP for animals and many other organisms to survive. The first two steps in cellular respiration, glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, produced a small amount of ATP from the breakdown of glucose. These steps also produced NADH and FADH2 molecules. Through the electron transport chain, the cell can now use the energy in NADH and FADH2 molecules to make many more molecules of ATP. The mitochondrion has two membranes, an outer membrane and an inner membrane, and is essentially a bag within a bag. The proteins of the electron transport chain reside in the inner membrane. Both NADH and FADH2 donate electrons to the chain. We will use NADH as an example. As electrons move from one complex to another in the chain, they transfer some of their energy to proteins that pump protons, also known as hydrogen ions, across the membrane. With each transfer, the electrons lose energy, which is used to pump more protons. What is the function of electrons carried to the chain by NADH and FADH2? To capture the energy from protons being pumped across the membrane, to release the energy stored in ATP molecules from glycolysis in the Krebs cycle, to provide the energy that pumps protons across the inner membrane of a mitochondrion, or to cycle back to the Krebs cycle to make more NAD+ and FAD. And the correct answer is to provide the energy that pumps protons across the inner membrane of a mitochondrion. The process of electron transfer results in a difference in the concentration of protons on the two sides of the membrane. This concentration difference, called a gradient, is a form of potential energy. What is a concentration gradient? The difference in concentration of a molecule between two sides of a membrane, the difference in height between the top and bottom of a hill, the difference in the concentration of ATP before and after the electron transport chain, or the attraction of opposite charges. And the correct answer is the difference in concentration of a molecule between two sides of a membrane. The oxygen that we breathe is essential for electron transport. Oxygen is exceptionally electron greedy and snatches electrons from the end of the electron transport chain. After grabbing electrons, it combines with protons to form water. From the operation of the electron transport chain, a concentration gradient of protons forms across the membrane. Like water held behind a dam, given the opportunity, the protons will tend to flow across the membrane barrier. A complex in the membrane provides a passageway for the protons and uses the energy from the proton flow to power the production of ATP. The protons will tend to flow in this direction until the concentrations are the same on both sides of the membrane, that is, until the gradient disappears. What is the purpose of the proton gradient in the electron transport chain? To make water by combining with oxygen, to provide the power to make ATP, to accept electrons, or to capture the energy from ATP. And the correct answer is to provide the power to make ATP. Why do hydrogen ions or protons flow back across the mitochondrial membrane? Because of their attraction to the water molecules in the mitochondrial matrix, because of the difference in concentration of hydrogen ions between the intermembrane space and the mitochondrial matrix, because of their attraction to electron-greedy oxygen atoms in the mitochondrial matrix, or because ATP can be made when they flow from the intermembrane space to the mitochondrial matrix. And the correct answer is because of the difference in concentration of hydrogen ions between the intermembrane space and the mitochondrial matrix. If the electron transport chain stops for any reason, such as a lack of oxygen to capture electrons at the end of the chain, the gradient will quickly disappear, turning off ATP production. The NAD+ molecules left over from the electron transport chain are later recycled back to glycolysis in the Krebs cycle, where they will capture more high-energy electrons from food molecules. What happens to the electron transport chain if oxygen is lacking? More NADH would be formed, the electrons would be recycled back to NAD+, the protons would be released as hydrogen gas, or the proton gradient would disappear. The correct answer is the proton gradient will disappear. What is a primary function of the electron transport chain? To create carbon dioxide and water, to use available oxygen, to harvest the remaining energy available in the glucose molecule. And the correct answer is to harvest the remaining energy available in a glucose molecule. ATP, produced in plenty during this last stage of cellular respiration, contains energy that had its origin in the molecule of glucose. Along the way, the energy took many forms, including the energy held by electron carriers, the energy released by transporting electrons in the electron transport chain, and the energy stored in the concentration gradient across a membrane. In the form of ATP, the energy originally in the bonds of glucose can be used to fuel cellular work. What is the overall purpose of cellular respiration? To break down glucose, to capture energy contained in the bonds of glucose in molecules of ATP, to make water and carbon dioxide, or to convert the higher energy electrons into lower energy electrons to make ATP. The correct answer is to capture energy contained in the bonds of glucose in molecules of ATP. Where was the energy in the original glucose molecule? Stored in the protons of a glucose molecule, stored in the oxygen atoms of a glucose molecule, stored in the bonds between the atoms of a glucose molecule, or stored in the carbon atoms of a glucose molecule. The correct answer is stored in the bonds between the atoms of a glucose molecule. Why is cyanide such a deadly poison? Cyanide is a deadly poison because it cripples the electron transport chain. Cyanide binds to the last complex in the chain, and in doing so, blocks oxygen from binding. Recall that during the operation of the electron transport chain, NADH donates electrons to the beginning of the chain. The process of electron transport fuels a pump of protons across a membrane. However, with cyanide already bound, oxygen cannot grab the electrons at the end of a chain. Therefore, no new electrons from NADH can be added at the beginning. Under these conditions, electron transport and proton pumping grind to a halt. Without the active pumping of protons to one side of the membrane, the proton concentration on both sides soon equalize. No longer do protons rush through the ATP-producing complex, and no more ATP is produced. Cells can't live long on the small quantity of ATP made by glycolysis, so without the ATP that comes from the electron transport chain, cells die. How does cyanide block the function of the electron transport chain? It grabs the protons that normally would bind with oxygen to make water. It grabs the electrons so that the protons are not pumped across the membrane. It combines with oxygen so that oxygen cannot accept electrons from the electron transport chain, or it blocks oxygen so that the oxygen cannot accept electrons from the electron transport chain. The correct answer is, it blocks oxygen so that the oxygen cannot accept electrons from the electron transport chain.